All right, so starting off for this section, what we want to do is look at this control panel. You can see that there's some artwork showing around these buttons. There's also all this black, which seems to possibly be a layer of paint on top. And then I'm not sure what's happening down here, but this is peeling and crusty. Either way, the way we have to deal with this doesn't really change. It's a shame, because it does look like if we were to use some citrus strip, we might be able to cleanly reveal some nice vinyl artwork under here, potentially. But at the end of the day, they drilled these holes, and so even if we have the artwork, we're going to have these extra holes. So my thought here is to open this up. And to just pull all of these switches out, to disconnect the joystick, and then to take this off of the chains, to pull all the hardware off, even to disconnect these wood bits that help it sit in the frame, and get it down to just the metal sheet, and to start using a scraper and just trying to get as much of this off as we can. And then from there, look at, I don't know, Goo Gone or sanding or sandblasting. But just to start to see how much of this we can actually get off cleanly. So let me move this over to a workable area and we'll get started. All right. It's actually interesting because it looks like we have even another layer under here. Knowing the Taito colors, the green likely means that before this was a Rygar, it was a jungle hunt. But I really don't think we have any hope of saving either of these. There's all this cracking along this edge here. There's the holes in them. So I think we're just gonna give it a scrape. There's some sort of clear layer over top of all that is coming off first. And yeah, there's a little bit of green goop left over from the citrus stripping process. Oh, there we go. If you've ever had to remove wallpaper, this feels very similar. The goal here is really just to get it back down to either the base paint or the metal. And then, like I said, we'll come through with an agent that's really built for removing glue to get rid of this kind of sticky glue layer that's getting left behind. Although every time I peel back this black stuff, it frustrates me, but it also makes me sad. Because if it weren't for the holes, this Rygar art is so nicely kept. Just like the bezel, just like the sides before I screwed up the citrus strip. It's just, this paint layer is very protective. But can't do anything about a bunch of drill holes. So right now, it seems like my best bet is once I get it under as I can, just kind of try to go slow, but again, all the paint layer. Getting this original vinyl off trickier. All right, well, this isn't going to be short. So, similarly to the side art, I'm going to work on this off camera. If the process changes, or if I get it done, I'll update you. So at this point, I've made some pretty decent progress, but I'm a little stuck. And so instead of putting a bunch of chemicals and solvents on here, I think the first thing I'm going to try is just to take this hair dryer and heat this up and see if I can loosen some of that old glue and see how that helps me remove this. All right, so it seems to have done a little bit. Let's try some more heat. Whew, all right, well, it's definitely helping a little bit, but I think that it's going to take a bit more heat, but let me continue with this process and I'll update you guys. Well, the heat seems to have done the trick. We've got all the artwork off, and now we're just left with this goopy, sort of sticky mess. Just adhesive that's left over from the vinyl wrap. So I've got this goof off gel spray, and we're going to see how that works. Basically, we just spray this down, it says. All right, it's been a couple minutes. Let's grab a microfiber cloth and see what we get. Definitely took some off, but I think what we need to do is let it sit for like 5-10 minutes, not just a couple minutes like the packaging said. And then I think it's also going to help to bring in a plastic scraper to help get this stuff up. So we've reapplied. Let's let it sit for a little bit longer, see where we get. It's been about 5 minutes. Let's see if we've made any better progress. Not much with that. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay, the scraper is what I need. Alright, I think we're just going to have to keep going over this with the goof off. It's definitely loosening it up, but I think it's going to take a couple of passes. So, not quite an instant solution. Might let it sit for longer next time, maybe 10 minutes. But it's definitely loosening it. But it's definitely loosening up the glue, and between the rag and the scraper, I think we're definitely going to get this off. So I'm not sure if you can tell in the camera, a lot of the glue came off, but there's still a fine sticky layer. So the goof off just doesn't seem to be getting the job all the way done. So my thought is that I'm just going to sand it, because honestly, this is going to need to be painted. I've already got to sand some of this rust. Also, before I start JB welding anything to try and fill in these holes, I'm going to need to rough those up a bit. So I think I'm going to take this sanding block and just try to do it a little gently and see where I get. as you can see, I was successful. I used my palm sander and some 40 grit sandpaper, and then I went back over it with a 220 grit just to kind of even it out. There's little bits here and there that could be cleaned up, but I think we're pretty much down to bare metal, and we're in a good place to start fixing the control panel. And so the question is, how do I do that? If we look at it from the front, we have, this is obviously the joystick, right? These 4 bolts, joystick bolts, and joystick goes there. And then we have a bunch of holes that have been added when it is a video poker. And so what I've been doing has been looking at original arcade control panels for Jungle Hunt. So this machine would have originally been a Jungle Hunt, a game I'm not very familiar with, and then Rygar was only ever sold as a conversion kit, so this would have been converted into a Rygar and then converted into a video poker. And so when they converted it to the video poker, they added some buttons. They honestly, I have to assume that these two are new because they also kind of drilled out a new section next to the joystick hole to make those line up. So Jungle Hunt was a 2-button game, but one thing I've noticed is that on those control panels it had buttons on both the left and the right side, which was for games where you only had one player at a time, was kind of a common practice to allow left-handed or right-handed people to play. And so the other indicator I have as to which, obviously joystick hole, that has to stay. And then as to which holes should stay, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe these notches, so you see these, this button, this button, this button, and this button, all have these tiny little notches in the side. And my understanding is that that is for buttons where instead of micro switches you would have leaf switches. They have little prongs that would kind of sit in those notches. So that leads me to believe that our extra holes are this hole, this hole, this hole, and this expansion to the joystick. Now I'm not going to address the expansion to the joystick right now, because honestly it's a little difficult to deal with. Trying to come up with a plan. And realistically, once this thing is painted, if you put I know I said the dust washer is supposed to go underneath, but if you do it the wrong way and you put it on top, that thing's completely hidden. What I've got here is basic baking parchment. And so what I want to do is I want to grab some washers that I bought and some JB Weld. And these washers are the closest washers I could find to the size of these holes. The size of these holes is standard arcade button 1 1/8 inch. Now, sadly I could not find 1 1/8 inch wide washers, but I found 1 inch washers. So that means we have about 1/8 of an inch to go. So what I want to do is put parchment on the back to kind of hold the JB Weld flatten in place while it cures. Parchment, in theory, is something that the JB Weld shouldn't stick to. However, JB Weld is sandable, and so once everything is in place and has cured for 24 hours, I will be coming back and hitting this with the sander again to clear out and smooth up those spots where I do the JB Weld. After that, just gonna hit this with some black spray paint. Nothing too crazy, because that's not the final finish. Once that's done, this will at least be able to be installed back in the cabinet, parts put on it, played for a while. But the ultimate goal is to order a new vinyl control panel overlay, which will go over the paint. But the idea of the paint is just to get a protective layer down to prevent rusting and things. As you can see, the sanding pretty much took all of the rust that was on there off, so we really just want to paint this to protect it. And again, it'll make it so it'll look nice back in the cabinet while I get around to fixing other things and eventually ordering the vinyl art. So what I'm going to do is start from the top of the control panel, because this is where I am going to apply my backing material. And let's see, we're getting rid of these two. Oh, it's just about exactly 2 squares wide of the parchment. Okay. And so that will cover up both of those. And then what I want to do is just get a little bit of electrical tape, something that will, come off easily when I want it to. Okay. Not putting a ton of electrical tape because I really don't want this to be, a nightmare to pull off. Just want something to kind of help keep this rectangle and from shifting too much while this cures overnight into tomorrow. And you'll notice this is puffing up a little bit. That's fine because this is going to lay like this when it dries. So we will try to stretch it out, kind of make sure it's as far across as it can go, but a little bit of puff isn't going to hurt anything, I don't think. Now, the other concern is whether or not this JB Weld, which is an epoxy for joining metals, comes in 2 parts. You mix them together, you spread it out, you let it dry for 24 hours. It's very strong and sandable. Hopefully strong enough to cover that 1/8 of an inch gap, but we'll find out. If not, then we'll sand off whatever happened and work on a new solution. But the point is, I've never done it before. I don't want it leaking out of here and onto my desktop, onto my carpet, etc. So I think that I'm trying to think about how to deal with this. Maybe we could seal this all the way around with tape just to be sure. Again, it's electrical tape. It shouldn't give me a ton of trouble coming off. And if it leaves any sort of residue, we already have to come back and sand this piece again once the JB Weld is dry. So I'm expecting the JB Weld to be fairly easy. I used a 40 grit and then a 220 to kind of clean it up. For those who don't know, a 40 grit is a very coarse sandpaper pad. It's good for removing things. So we had that layer of glue. Also, there was still, a layer of paint, and 40 grit was really good for that. But then that left a bunch of scratching. You can see a little bit of it there. I'm not super concerned with the etching because, again, we're throwing a layer of paint on this, so it doesn't need to be perfect. And then even if you can see it through the layer of paint, we're throwing a vinyl overlay on it after that. So it's really, really just kind of, in my mind, get it as good as you can. So, point being, if there's any residue from the electrical tape, should be able to get that off probably with the 220. I'm really not expecting to have to go down to a 40 grit for the JB Weld, because it is billed as being sandable. Typically, shouldn't have to go down to a 40 unless you're trying to get it all off, versus all we really want to do is just smooth it and get it to about the same level as the rest of the sheet. Okay. So now we need one more square here. guess I'll do bigger pieces of tape since we ended up kind of doing the edge just to make sure we didn't get any leakage. Do that from the beginning here. Though granted, I don't think leakage is going to be a huge issue because we're really just going to be filling in this maybe 1/8, 1/16 of an inch depth. We're not putting a ton of JB Weld on. And as we apply it, we're going to use a plastic paint scraper to make sure that we're not putting too much in there. But you can never be too careful. I might even just get a plastic trash bag to throw this all on top of. Make sure I don't ruin anything. I would use the tarp, but I have to let that thing sit out and dry. That goof off got everywhere. Don't think I would use that product again. At least not in this instance where I'm already planning to sand the thing. Of course, I forgot to hit record. So what I've done is just use a plastic scraper. I put the washers in there, and then I came through and filled in those holes pretty thoroughly with JB Weld. Just kind of going and touching them up at the moment to try and just get them filled as completely as possible. A little change of venue. We are outside on my deck, and our JB Weld is nice and cured and solid. But we have this one issue, where as it dried and cured, this washer is kind of over the edge here. Now, everything doesn't need to be perfectly flat. Like I said, this is going to get painted, and then eventually this is going to get a vinyl overlay. However, I'd like to try to get it as flat as possible. I don't think that's going to sand out, so I've got this grinding bit on my drill, and I think I'm going to try to gently grind it down and see where we get with that. Here's the problem. Whew. It's made a nice little nick here. I think once I've got this part ground down, I'll probably come back over this with some JB Weld and patch it up. Again, coat of paint, coat of vinyl. Shouldn't be seeing much of this. And you can see this thing is way off center. This is the top of the hole. This is the top of the washer. Oof. That wasn't even very close. Let me grab a hammer and see what we can do. Well, I intended to just try a whack to see if I got any movement. But, boom. There's your washer. Pretty well ground down, but just totally out of place. So I think what we'll do is use the grinder to kind of get in, clean up this hole as much as possible, and then go over a first pass of sanding all of this. washer probably sits up just like a 32nd of an inch maybe. But like I said, good enough. Good enough. And yeah, they're not going anywhere. This JB Weld is super strong stuff. So I think what we're going to try to do is, for this one, I have 3 more washers. I probably won't record it, but I'm going to set another washer, redo the JB Weld process, and sand it, and then next thing you see hopefully will be us painting. Hopefully just keep track of this one, make sure it goes smooth. Well, it's not quite perfect, but like I said, it really just needs to be good enough. So at this point, I'm going to take it out and spray it. Probably won't film that, and then we'll come back. All I'm going to do is really hit it with this Rust-Oleum paint and primer in one, flat black. Probably give it like 2-3 coats on each side, and then we'll be good, because this has a pretty quick dry time. So take it out back, throw some paint on it, and then we'll see about putting it back together. So the paint's nice and dry on our control panel. I have ordered the vinyl overlay, but it's probably going to take a couple weeks to get here, so I think it's time to start putting buttons back on. The only not quite perfect thing we really have is that this washer is set up just a hair high, but honestly I was running low on JB Weld, and it really, I don't think you're going to notice it once the overlay is on, so it didn't make sense for me to re-drill that hole. So what I'm going to do is put it back together, get it back on the cabinet, and we'll see how it goes. Okay. Yeah, one little nick there in the paint, but overall, pretty good. Let's get this on the cabinet. So first, I nearly forgot to put these wood pieces back on. And second, I forgot to talk about some of the interesting things that I've been looking into. So, obviously this piece here, super damaged. And I believe that's why this piece here isn't on the other side, right? So this is the latch, and there's, inside the cabinet, there's latches to hold down the control panel, and they lock onto this. Now there's 2 latches, one on either side, but only one piece for it to hook on. And I've got to assume that's because of whatever happened to take this giant chunk out of this board. So, at some point, I'm probably going to take measurements and cut a new piece of MDF to match the dimensions of this board, drill some new holes in it. The only thing I did notice is these holes for these mounting brackets, because obviously this wood is flush up against the control panel, so those are countersunk. As far as I know, you can just buy a countersunk bit or a countersinking bit, and that'll allow you to drill the holes for a countersink. And there was one more thing. Oh yes, So there are chains that attach to these bolts to basically stop the control panel from falling off. And there are also these washers. And these washers are kind of meant to lock the control panel onto the board under it so it doesn't go anywhere. Now, the problem with these is that they don't work so good. And also, when you take it off on the chain, it kind of drops down, and these just scratch the heck out. These just scratch up everything on the board under it. So, in the nearer term, probably going to try and replace this piece of wood. I'm thinking I'll do that when the control panel overlay comes, because I'm going to have to take all this off again at that point anyway. And then at that point, may also look into maybe some plastic or nylon washers that could go on here and do less damage to the board. Though when I do put this back on the machine, I'm also going to look at maybe shortening the chain so that potentially this couldn't come out far enough for these washers to kind of slip down and these washers to scratch that board. So just a couple of things. Now we're going to get this popped back on the machine. So I lost the video for putting the controller back on. However, did get a nice picture. So as you can see, the control panel's on there, and honestly, I think it looks really great. This will let me and my son continue to play the cabinet just fine while we wait for the control panel overlay, and I'm really happy with the result. We've even been playing with it for about a week or two, and that Rust-Oleum paint is holding up really well to some longer play sessions. Alright, so what did I learn? One of the main things I learned is that I just need to take my time. The control panel rebuild is something I'm just really not familiar with, and I really needed to take my time just to make sure that I got it where I was happy with it. Another thing I learned was that I need to be okay with things not being quite exactly perfect, and just be able to do them to the best of my ability. And then finally, I learned the value of the community. I did a lot of consulting on Discord and on Facebook with other folks who restore arcades to come up with an approach to repairing this control panel that I was comfortable with executing, and that would lead to a good result. You know, there are a lot of ways to do this fix. A lot of people recommended welding, but I have no idea how to weld. I don't have any equipment for welding. So kind of just looking at what I have, what I'm comfortable with, came up with this approach, and I think it turned out great. So please give a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you on the next video.